Not a single software developer ever said that a more loosely coupled code gives him headaches. On the contrary, tight coupling can and will create a bunch of things that are hard to deal with. But first, what is that loose coupling? Well, loose coupling means not instantiating dependencies of a class directly inside that class, but rather getting them from a centralized place. Dependencies are simply classes which are needed by other classes. For example, a Viewmodel needs a repository, so the repository is a dependency of the Viewmodel. Loose coupling also means that your classes operate with their dependencies through an interface and not directly with their concrete implementation. This allows you to swap implementations really easily. For example, a production implementation of a database will store data on a remote server, while a test implementation will store data only locally. Hello, welcome to ResoCoder, and in this tutorial you are going to learn how to put what I just said into practice by using a dependency injection framework called Kodein. It is specifically designed to work well with Kotlin, and it's also compatible with Java. And in this tutorial you are gonna build this simple app, this dependency injection app, and you might already recognize this app from my previous tutorial, which was about plain old model view Viewmodel architecture without any kind of a fancy dependency injection framework, because in that tutorial we built our own really simple but functional dependency injection by calling some kind of a function on an util object. But in this tutorial, you are going to actually learn how to use a fully fledged dependency injection framework, which will make your life so much easier. This tutorial will be using the MVVM, so model view Viewmodel pattern. So if you want to learn more about that, check out my previous tutorials on that. I have a tutorial where I explain the absolute basics of model view Viewmodel, so you should probably start off with that by clicking on the card in the corner. And before we get into coding, I will just show you what this app does. And if you already watched my previous tutorial, you really know what this does. It really just gets a quote. So let's say quote or quotes, and then it gets an author. Let's say, hi, nice to meet you, and add that quote. So it's over here. And that's the only thing that this app is doing, but there is quite a bit of code behind this app because we need to store it somehow. We are simulating a database, but it's only a local database. It's stored actually inside a mutable list. And now, without any further ado, let's get right to it and let's do some dependency injection and loose coupling stuff. So let's create a new project. We are gonna start with an empty activity and hit next. And by the way, I am using Android Studio version 3.3 Canary 5. So if you have anything like 3.2 or 3.3, you should be good to go with to follow along with this tutorial. But I think that you should be able to use older versions too, but I'm not sure. Just get the most up-to-date version and you will be definitely good to go. So we are gonna call this application to be dependency injection. Be sure to select the language to be Kotlin, and we don't need to include navigation controller, but if you want to learn more about navigation controller, which is something like storyboards for Android, if you are familiar with the iOS storyboards. So if you want to learn about that, definitely check out the tutorial by clicking on the card in the corner. But we don't want to use it in this tutorial, and now let's hit finish. And here we are. As the first thing, let's open up build.gradle for the module app, and I'm going to paste a bunch of plugins inside here. And you can get the code from this tutorial by clicking on the link in the video description, which is gonna take you to resocoder.com. So just add these plugins inside here. So we are adding the lifecycle extensions, release candidate for the Viewmodel, and also adding Kodein plugin. The first one is a generic Kodein plugin, and then we also have a specific Android plugin for Kodein. And also let's hit Alt Enter to update these implementations of app compat and constraint layout. This is something that you should always do. When you can update something, just update it and you will be good to go. Now let's hit sync now in the corner. Let's also go over to the activity main XML, which we have already opened from the start. And I am just gonna paste all of the code, XML code inside of here so that you don't need to watch me type this out. So basically, and again, you can get this code from the link in the video description. And what this is that we have the first text view is for displaying quotes. We don't have any recycler view because we want to keep this simple, because this is not a tutorial about recycler view, but rather about dependency injection with Kodein. Then we also have an edit text for the quote input and then also for the author. And then we have a single button for adding the quote. So that's it for the layout. And now let's look at the project structure. When we open up Java and then the first package, you can see that we have only main activity inside here. First, we are going to add the packages and then we are going to create classes and interfaces inside of them. So first, let's add a package for data. So right click, new package, and its name will be data. And then inside this data package, we will have also a child package basically, which will be called DB for database, because we are going to be working with a fake database in this tutorial. And you can ignore that the DB package is not currently displayed. It's really in there, but just Android Studio doesn't want to display empty packages for some reason. Then also another package under data, which will be called model, because we need to have some kind of a model for quotes. And you can see that now we can even see these children packages when we have two of them inside there. So we have DB, we have model, which will have the quote model, which will basically just store a text for the quote text and then the text for the author name. So really simple model. Class, nothing fancy in there for the quote. And then also we want to have a package for the repository. Just add it inside there. Then we also want to have a package for the UI. So we are gonna right click not on data, but rather on the root package. And we are gonna create a new package. Its name will be UI. And the UI package will have a children package called quotes. Because if you want to have multiple activities or multiple fragments, you probably want to separate them into their own packages so that if you want to change something later, once you have even deployed the app, you can come back to this code and really easily find what you need to change, because nothing's worse than trying to find something and you don't know where to find it. That is absolutely horrible. You want to prevent that as much as possible. And once we have this, we can basically start creating our classes. But first, we are going to put this main activity class over to UI. But we don't want to put it into UI directly, but rather into UI.quotes. And we can choose that. So UI.quotes and hit refactor. All right, now let's also change the name of the main activity. So Shift and F6, and its name will be quotes activity. And also the under S and layout, we want to change the activity main to say activity quotes. We can now close all of the code that is opened in Android Studio. First, we are going to build the model, so the quote class, and then we are going to build the database classes and interfaces, and then the repository and Viewmodel, and then we are going to put it all together and actually do some dependency injection with the library Kodein. So don't worry, I'm going to explain everything, but there is time for that. That's because we first need to have the architecture in order for the dependency injection to have any kind of a meaning. So under the model package, we are going to create a new Kotlin class, and its name will be quote. And it's going to be a data class. And if you watch my previous tutorial, you probably already know this, but if you haven't, just follow along and you will be good to go. So it will contain text, of type string, and also val author of type string. And then it will have one function which will be override fun to string, and it will return concatenated string, so $ text and then dash and author. So that's it for this quote model. Now let's create a quote data access object, but we are gonna first create its interface. So under DB, we want to create a new interface, and its name will be quote DAO. And this interface will have two functions, and basically, if you don't know what a data access object is, it is an interface through which we add stuff and also get stuff from our local database. When you are using the Room library, which is a wrapper around SQLite on Android, you will need to create data access objects. We aren't using Room in this tutorial, but we can still fake it so that it looks like we are using it, so that if you want to build actual production grade app, you will have the knowledge of how to create DAOs. So yeah, that's basically why we are creating DAOs in this tutorial, even though we are not using the Room database. And also, you would probably benefit from watching my previous tutorial. You can learn more about this stuff from that tutorial by clicking on the card in the corner. So this interface will have two functions. One will be for adding quote. So quote of type quote. And then the second one will be fun get quotes. And it will simply return live data of type list quote. And if you don't know what a live data is, you should really watch my previous tutorial where I explain everything in depth. Now, if you would be using the Room library, all you would do is to create a DAO interface. Then the Room library would create the implementation of the interface for you. Because we aren't using any kind of Room library, we need to create the implementation ourselves, and it will be a fake implementation, and we are gonna call that class quote DAO fake implementation. So IMPL, which is short for implementation, and it's gonna be a class. As the first thing that we are gonna do here is that this class implements quote DAO interface, and then we want to have a fake database table, so private val quote list, which will be a simply in-memory list, not a real database, which is persistent, but this is only a simple tutorial, so that's why I am omitting all kinds of complicated stuff in here. So private val quote list, it will be a mutable list of, its type will be quote, because we want to store quotes inside this quote list. And then we are gonna have mutable live data private val quotes. So we want to have it as mutable live data of type list of quotes. And mutable live data is from the architecture components library, and live data can be observed for changes if you're not familiar with it, but really watch my previous tutorial, as I am saying probably for the fourth time already. We want to keep our mutable live data private because mutable live data can be changed, so we want to be able to change only from the inside of the class, so that's why it's private. And then the quote DAO interface, as you can see here, exposes only live data which is not mutable through the get quotes function. So that's because we don't want to have outside classes access to changing the live data directly. Then inside the init block, we want to set quotes data value to be equal to quote list. So we are actually changing the value of the mutable live data from within the class, because we want to immediately connect the now empty quote list to the mutable live data, which can be observed from outside. Then we are gonna implement the interface by overriding two functions. So override fun first add quote. And in here we want to get the quote list. And we want to add a quote. And then we want to set the quotes value to be equal to quote list, which we have just updated. Just like this, because after adding a quote to the database, our fake database, we want to update the value of mutable live data, which will notify its active observers. And then we have another function, another overridden. I cannot write today, sorry about that. And this get quotes can be actually only a one-line function. We don't even need to specify the return type explicitly because we wanna just return quotes, which is the mutable live data, as live data of type list quotes. Just like this. Now let's create the database interface. So right click on DB, hit new. It's gonna be an interface and it's called database with lowercase b. And if you are using the room library, this would be an abstract class, but the goal is the same whether you are using room or not, as we are not in this tutorial, because a database class or interface simply wants to hold all of the data access objects. In this case, we are gonna hold our single DAO, which is val quote DAO of type quote DAO. So that's about it for this interface. And now we are going to create a database fake implementation. So right click, new class, database fake IMPL. This class will obviously implement database interface, which we have just created. And we are going to override the val quote DAO, and we are going to simply set it to be, actually we can leave the type in here, and it's going to be simply set to be of quote DAO fake implementation. And we also want to instantiate it over here. And no dependency injection is needed here because fake database will always want fake data access objects, so we want to instantiate them directly. However, in other classes, which we are going to create in just a bit, we aren't going to instantiate our dependencies directly like this, but we are going to utilize the dependency injection so that we have loose coupling and independent code. Also, the database class will be a singleton, but we don't need to do any crazy stuff like we did in my previous tutorial on pure MVVM, because the singletons will be actually handled by the Kodein library, so we don't need to worry about any of that stuff, about any of that thread safety and keeping the instance and any of that. Kodein is gonna handle it for us. Alright, now let's create the repository interface under the repository package. So right click, new Kotlin interface repository, or actually quote repository. And a repository is the single source of truth for all data that our view models request. And this quote repository interface will have only two functions, for adding quote and also for getting quote, which are the same functions as the quote DAO has over here. So we can just copy it and paste all of that inside our quote repository interface. And yeah, we want to have these imports over here as well. And you will probably have more than one data access objects in your app, and repository interface will act as a collection of all of the DAO interfaces with some other functionality added on top. So in a real production app where you have dozens of DAOs and you also need to sync data with the server and all of that kind of crazy stuff, you are not going to have a direct copy of a DAO over in repository. The repository will be more complex than single DAOs by design. So now the repository can seem like an unnecessary step, but it's really necessary if you are building a real app. We are not building a real awesome app, just a simple quote app, so that's why it can seem to be so boring, this repository, but in fact, it's really cool to have it. Alright, now let's create the implementation for this repository interface, and in that class, we are actually going to utilize the dependency injection, which Kodein will do for us. So this class will be called code repository impl for implementation. Because we are gonna be using dependency injection over here, we are just gonna have private val quote DAO of type quote DAO as the property which is declared inside the constructor, and be sure to have this typed as quote DAO interface and not the concrete implementation of the DAO. This way, if you want to switch from our fake DAO to something more elaborate, which is actually a real database, so it saves into a real local database, not only inside a list, so you will be able to really easily switch the implementation if you have everything as an interface. Also, this class will implement code repository interface, so just do this. And we are going to have two functions, one for adding quote. So add quote, we are going to just call simply quote DAO.add quote, and then also override fun get quotes, and we are gonna simply return, so equals quote DAO.get quotes. And this may seem redundant, but again, imagine a code which also updates and checks the backend and so on. This class will also be a singleton, and it will be also handled by the Kodein library. Now, let's create a quotes Viewmodel factory under UI.quotes package. So let's create a new class, quotes Viewmodel factory. This factory will create instances of quotes Viewmodel, which is a class which we are gonna create in just a little while. We need to have this factory because otherwise we cannot pass anything inside the instance of a quotes Viewmodel, and we want the quotes Viewmodel to contain one property of type quote repository, because a Viewmodel needs to communicate with the backend somehow, and every Viewmodel has a repository with which it can communicate. And because our quotes Viewmodel needs to have a repository, our factory for our Viewmodels also need to have that repository in here, and it will be gotten through dependency injection. So private val quotes repository of type quote repository, just like this. So this will be all injected through Kodein, and it will inherit from Viewmodel provider.new instance factory. It will have only one function called create. So it looks like this. Just type create and hit enter, and it's gonna be written for you by Android Studio, and it's going to return our not yet existent class, but we are gonna create it in just a bit. So it will be called quotes Viewmodel, and it will also accept the quote repository, and we will cast it as the type T, and we will also add a suppress annotation. So add suppress, and we want to suppress names unchecked cast, because this cast, this as, is unchecked. Now we even cannot see that it's unchecked because we have an error over here, but when this error goes out, this would be marked as an unchecked cast, and that's really not what this is. It's just that the compiler cannot check it, but we know that this will be correct for sure. So we can safely ignore this warning. Alright, now let's create the class for the quotes Viewmodel. So again, under UI quotes, new class, quotes Viewmodel. It will also have one private constructor property, quote repository, which we are going to get from the quotes Viewmodel factory over here. So let's add it inside here. So private val quote repository of type quote repository as an interface. That's really important. You want to have this as an interface, not as the concrete class. And we are going to inherit from Viewmodel. Quotes Viewmodel will also have only two functions, which are also present in the quote DAO and also in the quote repository. So one for adding quotes and one for getting quotes. So fun add quote, it will accept a quote of type quote. So just like this, and we are going to simply call quote repository.add quote, and we want to pass this quote to the repository actually. And then also fun get quotes, and this will simply return whatever is in the quote repository by calling get quotes. Now let's go over to quotes activity and let's implement that, and then we are going to delve into the dependency injection itself. So first over here inside onCreate, we want to call a function called initializeUI, which we are gonna create in just a bit. And now hit Alt Enter, and we want to create function initializeUI down here. So private fun initializeUI, and inside we want to initialize our UI. How else? And this could be simplified by using the data binding library. Data binding is just a really nice way to simplify your activity code, because you can put many things right inside the XML and not inside your activity class. So you can access the Viewmodel properties right from XML, which will save you a lot of coding. And if you want to learn how to use data binding library with live data, you can check out the tutorial by clicking on the card in the corner. But now we are not using data binding, so we need to do everything inside this initializeUI function. And because I don't want to bore you, I'm gonna paste the contents of this function in here, and I'm going to walk you through it. And also you can get the code from the link in the video description, which is gonna take you to resocoder.com. So should you need this code, you can just copy it from there. Whoa, and I've just noticed that we don't have Viewmodel factory inside here instantiated. We are actually going to get it by dependency injection soon, but before we do any dependency injection, let's get it going through normal instantiation. So private val Viewmodel factory of type quotes Viewmodel factory, and we are going to simply instantiate quotes Viewmodel factory inside here and pass quote repository. You know what, we are not going to pass quote repository over there because it's not going to work anyway, and we are going to change it to dependency injection in just a bit. So let's have this instantiation in here just so that our code below doesn't give us any errors that we don't have Viewmodel factory. So let's also import observer, so Android X lifecycle observer, and let's also import quote. All right. So over here we want to use Viewmodel providers to create or get already created quotes Viewmodels for this activity, because if there are already created Viewmodels, we want to get them. We don't want to instantiate new ones because we want to preserve their state. So for example, if the quotes Viewmodel has a value, some kind of an X property, let's call it X, and that X property of type integer is holding the value of 5, and we get this a screen rotation, then we want to get the same Viewmodel because we want to have that value of 5 inside of it. We don't want to create a new Viewmodel because that would reset the X to be 0 again. We don't want to have that. We want to preserve state, and that is one huge advantage of using Viewmodels, because they preserve state through configurations changes. Here we are observing live data from the quotes Viewmodel, which in turn observes live data from the repository, and that repository observes live data from the DAO. So we are calling get quotes on the Viewmodel, we are observing it, and in the observer we are simply building the list of all of our quotes with a string builder, and then we are displaying the final string inside our text view quotes, which is the topmost text view inside our layout. And then we also have a button click, and whenever the button add quote is clicked, we want to construct a new quote with all of the values which are from the edit text, so edit text quote and edit text author, and then we add that quote through our Viewmodel to the repository, and that repository in turn adds it to the DAO. So yeah. Alright, now when we have all of the architecture complete, let's actually get the dependency injection going, and we are going to get it going inside an application class. So let's create a new class. It will be inheriting from application class, and its name will be quotes application. We are gonna be doing dependency injection stuff inside the application class because application class is accessible from every component of our app, whether it's activities, fragments, anything. You can access application from anywhere, even from services. So it's going to inherit from application and also instantiate it over here. And it's also going to be Kodein aware. Because it is Kodein aware, we can override a val Kodein of type Kodein, and we are going to set it to be Kodein.lazy. So Kodein is equal Kodein.lazy because it is lazily initialized, and it is initialized only once the application is ready to go. So when the onCreate has run. And Kodein has a really nice domain-specific language, also called as DSL. It's really simple. We want to bind database, which is our interface for database, and we want to bind this interface with singleton because our database needs to be a singleton. It doesn't make sense to have multiple instances of our database class at once because that's plain stupid to have multiple databases unless you have different databases, but it doesn't make sense to have multiple databases of the same type, obviously. So we want to bind it with singleton. Really simple thus far. And this singleton, so let's import it over here. So Alt Enter, import from Kodein DI generic singleton. All right. And this singleton will simply instantiate the implementation for our database. So we are binding this database interface to an implementation, which is in our case, database fake implementation, and let's also instantiate it over here. So whenever we are requesting a database instance as an interface, we are going to create a singleton of type database fake implementation, and then whenever we are requesting the database again and it's already being created in this application instance, we are not gonna instantiate it again, but we are gonna simply return the already instantiated database because it's a singleton. It's only instantiated once, and then we are returning the single instance. And using interfaces over here and not concrete classes is really important because, as you can see, if we had some different implementations, so database production implementation, so prod for production. So if we had this is all that we need to change here. And all the code is still working, but the code would not be operating with a fake database implementation, but with a production implementation, which is communicating with a remote server and not just storing things inside a simple list. So this is really powerful stuff that you see here. You can also create different modules for testing and all of that, but I'm not gonna get into that in this tutorial because I just wanna show you how awesome Kodein is, and I don't want to get really in depth. But however, the Kodein documentation is really awesome, so you can check it out from the link in the video description. I really encourage you to go through it, and you are gonna learn so much stuff from over there that you will have your head blown. So basically, you won't have to change the fake to prod in your projects because you can create some modules and they will basically do it for you. So you can be even more lazy than you are now. You don't even need to type something out. It will be changed for you whenever you are testing. But now enough about modules, because we are not gonna touch them in this tutorial, so let's do something more which we are gonna actually use in this particular app. So then we want to also bind quote_DAO, which is again an interface, so quote_DAO interface, and it's also going to be bound with a singleton. And if you are wondering why we don't need to use the dot and all of that and the parentheses, this is because when we hit Ctrl B on the with, you can see that with is an infix function, and infix functions in Kotlin don't need to use the dot and parentheses to actually be called. You can just write them as if they were part of the Kotlin language, which is pretty cool. And this singleton is a bit tricky. We don't want to simply instantiate quote_DAO fake implementation like this, because it doesn't make sense. We have all of the DAOs centered around database. So every DAO that we possibly want to get, we can get it from the database implementation. So how are we going to get the database implementation to over here, to this singleton? Basically, what we want to do is to call instance, which is a function of Kodein, and we want to get an instance of our database, right? So now let's hit Alt Enter and import this function of instance, and this instance database call will simply return our database, which is bound just the line above. And we want to get the quote_DAO from there. Then also we want to bind quote repository, and we want to bind it again with singleton. And we want to bind it to quote repository implementation. But here's the problem. Quote repository implementation needs a quote_DAO to be passed inside of there. If we take a look at it, you can see that this repository accepts a private val quote_DAO of type quote_DAO. Luckily, we already have this quote_DAO bound inside the Kodein. So as you can see over here, just the line above, we have bound quote_DAO to be the quote_DAO from the instance of our database. We can pass this quote_DAO over to quote repository implementation by simply writing instance, and Kodein will pass the quote_DAO over to quote repository for us. Hopefully you can see how powerful this thing is. Lastly, we need to bind our quotes Viewmodel factory, because we are actually going to need that inside our quotes activity, because we need to bind this factory over here. We don't want to instantiate it directly, because that is just not cool. We don't have any kind of an interface for our factory though, so we are not going to bind it through an interface, but through a concrete class. So let's write bind quotes Viewmodel factory, and we want to bind it with provider, and provider is the opposite of singleton. While singleton only provides you with a single instance, so once the singleton is instantiated, it always returns the same instance. However, with provider, with each and every call, you are getting a new instance and not the same one. So provider instantiates new instance each time that you request this quotes Viewmodel factory or whatever you are binding with provider. So we want to instantiate quotes Viewmodel factory, just like this. And this also needs a quote repository, so we are gonna pass an instance of it, and Kodein will handle everything for us. And now if you take a look at this last line, in which we are binding the quotes Viewmodel factory, it is a bit long. And because we are binding to the same class, so we are binding quotes Viewmodel factory to the same class of quotes Viewmodel factory, we actually can shorten this by using a different kind of syntax. So we can remove these type parameters from here, from the bind, and we are now going to use the with function, but rather from. And now we have effectively shortened the last line, but it does the same thing, we just omitted the type parameters of bind. Because we are binding to the same class as we are actually instantiating inside the provider. So it's going to infer the type for us. Kodein is really smart. Alright, and now let's go back to quotes activity class. It's going to also implement Kodein aware. We are gonna override val Kodein, and we are going to set it to be the closest Kodein. So Kodein by, because it's going to be lazy. When you use by in Kotlin, it's going to be lazily initialized. So by closest Kodein. What this closest Kodein will get is actually the Kodein which we have defined inside quotes application right over here. And then the last thing that we need to change inside quotes activity is to not directly instantiate quotes Viewmodel factory, but rather get it by instance. And this we are calling on this Kodein object. So we are getting the proper instance of quotes Viewmodel factory from Kodein, which will actually trigger a chain reaction. Because if you take a look at the quotes application Kodein, over here, when we request quotes Viewmodel factory, we are passing an instance of quote repository inside this quotes Viewmodel factory by calling this instance function. So then, in turn, we need to get the quote repository because we need to pass it inside the Viewmodel factory. This repository needs an instance of our quote DAO, so it goes one line up. And quote DAO needs an instance of type database, so it goes again one line up. And then we need database, and here the chain reaction ends because database doesn't have any kind of dependencies. Alright, and now the last thing that we need to do over here is to go over to Android manifest.xml, and we need to set the name of our application to be the quotes application, and let's also hit Alt Enter. And we want to suppress the Google App Indexing warning because these squiggly lines are driving me crazy. Awesome, now let's hit run inside the emulator and we shall see if it works or not. Alright, so here we are inside our dependency injection Kodein app which we have just built, and we can add a quote, hello. It was set by who else than ResoCoder. And let's hit add quote, and it works. And then also another quote, some gibberish over here and gibberish over there. Add quote, and it also works. And now let's test the rotation. All right, so it's going to rotate, and that works also. Now rotate it back, and that works too. So yeah, we have a working app. In this tutorial, you learned how to structure your app properly and also how to use dependency injection with the Kodein library. If you want to get the code from this tutorial, check out the link in the video description, which is gonna take you to resocoder.com. Also, there is the link to Kodein library itself, so definitely go through the documentation so that you learn more about that. It's really worth it. If this video helped you with structuring your app and you also learned how to use Kodein for dependency injection, or even if you learned dependency injection in general, give this video a like and also share it. If you don't want to miss more tutorials like this, subscribe to this channel and also hit the bell button so that you are not gonna miss anything, so that you will be actually notified about stuff. Leave a comment if you have anything to say, if you have any suggestions or questions regarding dependency injection and Android in general. Follow me on social media and see you in the next video.